So I know at the end of my Pal World video, I said the next game I was covering was going to be Jak II, but I went and looked at my Google Sheet where I've stored all information regarding this backlog project again, and it looks like I actually beat a game before Pal World, and so we're going to cover that now. That game, as you could tell by the title and thumbnail, is Banjo-Kazooie. It's a very interesting one for my own personal history, but I'm not going to have anything too inflammatory to say about it. Banjo-Kazooie was a game made by Rare that, along with Super Mario 64, helped popularize the collectathon action-adventure experience. It's something that is always remembered as having done this super well, to the point that when the developers all eventually left Rare and formed a new company, they said they were going to make a game just like Banjo-Kazooie, and it was one of the most successful Kickstarters, at least at the time. I don't know about to this day. But that's getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Rare is a pretty prolific company in sort of these, what would we call them? If the NES is the toddler years, then we can say that the Super Nintendo and the N64 are the childhood of our modern video game consoles. And during that time, Rare dominated. Just off the top of my head, I can remember Donkey Kong Country 1 through 3, Perfect Dark, Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, Donkey Kong 64, Conker's Bad Fur Day, and I'm sure I'm missing a few others, all just within this 2-console lifespan. And all of these games, all of them, are held up as fantastic to this day. For me personally, Banjo-Kazooie was a game that we only ever rented. It's not one that I ever owned. So my experience with it has really just been with the first half of the game prior to actually playing it now. I should note that the way that I played it is the Nintendo Switch's N64 library. It's something that you can get access to if you have the more premium version of an online subscription, which gets you access to N64 games, Game Boy Advance games, and several pieces of DLC as well. So with that, Banjo-Kazooie is available, but Banjo-Tooie isn't. Rare is kind of in this weird spot where they were bought by Microsoft in the early 2010s, and so even though all of these games are incredibly famous for being on Nintendo consoles, most of them aren't available there today because Rare's no longer associated with Nintendo. In fact, one of the best ways that someone could access Rare's catalog would actually be through the Rare Replay, which was released by Microsoft, I think, in the previous console generation, so that would be the Xbox One, I believe. I don't think it's available on Game Pass. It might be available on PC. I'll probably put something up on the screen detailing how to get it. But in any case, that's the method I chose so that I could play the game again. Just as a kind of foreword as we get into the actual game discussion here, I'm saying this bit more towards the end of the actual recording process. I do these without a script. I'm just going purely off the top of the dome and what my thoughts are about the game. But one thing I'm noticing as I'm talking about Banjo-Kazooie is I don't have a lot to say about the game itself, but rather how it compares to other games. And so a lot of the discussion that follows is really going to be about Banjo-Kazooie's broader place, I guess just within the history of gaming itself. Banjo-Kazooie is largely part of a series of games that marked an inflection point in what video games could be as they made the jump from 2D to 3D. And I think it's worth pointing out the games that managed to get that right. You know, we often look at titles like Super Mario 64 and Zelda Ocarina of Time. You know, maybe some people throw Spyro in there. In terms of just really early, ubiquitous mainstream successes of 3D games. But that's maybe the one area where I feel like Banjo-Kazooie doesn't come up often enough. The same way that I would point that out with games on the NES. You know, ones that manage to take the arcade-based ludology and start putting a story behind it, start crafting an experience that a player is meant to see through to the end. And so a lot of what I have to say about Banjo-Kazooie follows that sort of through line. But alright, let's get into it. Briefly, just to cover the plot for anyone unfamiliar, Banjo and Kazooie live in a house near Spiral Mountain with Banjo's sister, I believe her name is Tootie. Also within the Spiral Mountain area is a witch who is constantly antagonizing the area, and yet she hasn't been dealt with prior to this. Fine. So Gruntilda the witch kidnaps Tootie and plans to use her in an experiment to make Gruntilda younger and more attractive. That's the premise. And so it's up to Banjo and Kazooie to go save her. And to do this, very similarly to Super Mario 64, they have to traverse multiple worlds, collect various things from music notes, which are this game's version of coins, and you do get a reward for getting 100 of them within one level, to their star equivalent jiggies, which are jigsaw pieces used to unlock later levels. There's also various things that power Banjo and Kazooie's moves, like red and gold feathers that'll just be strewn about the levels. Also eggs that can be shot out of either end of Kazooie, actually. And then there are also the Jinjos. These are, I guess you could consider them a red coin equivalent, in that there are 6 of them per stage, and when you gather all of them, you get a Jiggy. Again, the star equivalent. One thing I also enjoy about this game from modern standards is just how good the controls still feel. It's kind of hard to explain, but controls in video games and how we expect video games to react when we do things like jump or punch or shoot have largely become a bit homogenized in the current mainstream space. And what I mean by that is our conceptions around these things have hardened to a point that we only expect them one way. And so regardless of what game we're playing, there are certain things that we can just sort of expect. Nowadays, every shooter has shoot bound to the right trigger because of the analogy to how an actual gun is fired. This is something that I want to say was started by the likes of Halo and Call of Duty in like the early Xbox and PS2 era, but before then you would just see it bound to whatever button and it would vary game to game. Certain things like the way a character jumps or the way that a lock-on system is handled would also vary wildly from game to game. And so it's interesting to me that even playing Banjo-Kazooie today, everything still feels intuitive. It's as though they were able to strike the right balance with these kinds of things at a time when that balance was still being explored. And I think that's a pretty significant feat in and of itself. I know at the time, the idea of getting a 3D platformer's controls right, or making the camera easy to control, or even just the idea of having to control a camera at all, were really new to these consoles in this era of gaming. And yet, playing it now, it's all still easily understood and worked with. And that's something I can't say for a lot of games, even ones that came after this. Like, I've seen countless examples in the Xbox, PS2, and GameCube era where it looks like the fundamentals established by games like Banjo-Kazooie and Super Mario 64 have just been completely abandoned. There are countless situations while I'm playing these different games where it's just impossible to position the camera the way I want to, or, you know, a jump was made so tight and so unforgiving that it would take several minutes to even be able to attempt it again. One thing I always also find personally interesting with these sort of collect-a-thon games is the idea of what you can get away with not collecting. I'm in the middle of a playthrough of Spyro Year of the Dragon for Xbox, and one of the things I find really interesting with it is how many of the collectibles I'm able to completely skip because they have no bearing on my access to later levels or the final boss. And when all I'm going for is credit roll and I'm not trying to get 100% completion, I will just skip what I can. But in Banjo-Kazooie, you need the music notes not just to get a Jiggy when you find all 100, but your cumulative music note count across every stage gates your access to later levels. There are literally doors with music note counts written on them, and you cannot proceed unless your cumulative music note count is higher than the number on the door. And it is only beyond that door that you would then find new levels that you then have to plug jiggies into before you can access those. This sort of two-pronged approach means that the majority of the collectibles, whether you're seeking jiggies or not, are worth taking the time to pick them up. As for others like the red feathers, gold feathers, and eggs, those are all consumable as you use various moves that are part of Banjo-Kazooie's toolkit, and so naturally you'll need to replenish those over time as you find challenges that require you to use those moves. And so for being a collectathon with all of these various things that you could be picking up that all do different things, they all still tie in well to the actual objective of the game. And that's something I have come to appreciate so much over the 6.5 years at this point that I've been doing this backlog project. There's a couple aspects of this game that I feel have aged compared to modern gaming sensibilities. For example, unless you're playing an updated Microsoft release of the game, any death within a level resets your music note count. Whereas, as I understand it, in the remakes, they made it so that even if you leave a level midway through, you keep your same music note count. Because one of the things that's distinct about this game versus Mario 64 is there are exactly 100 music notes in each level, if I'm remembering correctly. So it's not like Mario where you can essentially go to any part of the level, gather some coins, and feel like you can still potentially get the 100 coin star. You have to do this perfectly in a one-life run in order to actually get that specific jiggy. Even though the release on Nintendo Switch isn't this updated Microsoft version, you do still get access to 4 save state slots, which, as I covered back in my blogging days, I do use these, especially on older games. I feel like this save state system allows me to better take these older games and still make them match up with modern sensibilities regarding segments that you have to replay, what you can skip, even just how lives work in general. For example, when I went back and played the original Ninja Gaiden for NES, I was mortified at the idea of having to get these levels right in a single shot with just how much chaos there is on the screen. And so save states provided a way for me to still get through this challenging content and not feel like I was wasting a bunch of time having to replay the same level over and over again. And so when it comes to Banjo-Kazooie, most of the time I use save states to make sure that if I missed a very tight jump and would have to replay like a full minute to get back up to where I was, I could just reset. And these sort of things I think are more a matter of convenience than I would consider them to be cheating in any way. With pretty much any boss fight, I still try to do it in a single shot. There are a couple exceptions, like Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, where, I mean, for that fight, I probably save stated every time I got a solid hit on Tyson, just because it's so impossible. But anyway, this is all becoming a big tangent. I don't even know if this is going to make it into the final video at this point. Maybe the only bad thing that I have to say about Banjo-Kazooie itself is in the lead up to the final boss. There's a segment where you essentially have to play a trivia game and like cross a giant board game answering these trivia questions. It's maybe the single lowest point in the entire game because it relies on such esoteric information that I don't know what I would have done with this if I had gotten to it when I was, between 6 and 8 years old. There's no way I would have remembered or thought to write down everything that, like, Gruntilda's good witch sister tells you about her, all the random gossip that she has. I wasn't, like, writing down the specific number of a given enemy in a given stage. I can only assume that was one of the questions. I really can't remember any of them at this point. I'll be honest, for this part of the game, I just utilized save states before every question, and then if I didn't get the answer right, I just went back now that I could guess again. Because it's not fun. It's not a test of anything that has been reinforced by the rest of the gameplay. It feels like it just comes out of left field and then is never referenced again, because the final boss fight actually relies on the things that you've learned and had to do to get through all of these other levels, which is the way that it should be. It's just a weird inclusion overall. I should also note that Grant Kirkhope's soundtrack for this game is just fantastic. There's a general bounciness and lightheartedness to a lot of the songs that I find comparable to the Simpsons theme or other works from Danny Elfman. The soundtrack also does something really interesting technology-wise, where certain segments of the songs will drop out or come in or reduce in volume or be played by a new instrument purely based on the location that Banjo and Kazooie are currently in. This is something that we had seen at the time, maybe with like an underwater theme, but for the most part, even if you were to go play, say, Super Mario 64, you just kind of have one song in one mode for everything that you're doing in that level. Whereas with Banjo-Kazooie, in the early beach and pirate themed level, there are a lot of different instances where you can see this. There's a conch shell where if you go inside, I believe it mutes a lot of the track. There's the very top of the level with the lighthouse, where a lot of the sound kind of fades back and is mostly just replaced with like wind sound effects. There are underwater segments that slow the track down and lower the volume. It's a lot of context-based musical changes. This is something that was really kind of unheard of at the time, but it's the way that all video game soundtracks are put together these days. For example, with Doom Eternal, I believe there's an interview you can find with Mick Gordon talking about why it was taking so long to put together an official OST for Doom Eternal from the music that he had, in which he explains you don't have set compositions, you have all of these different elements that are reactive to what's currently going on with the player that he then has to rearrange into a single cohesive piece if he wants to put it on an album.
Let me show you guys, I think let's start off by sort of showing how the music from a Doom game is put together. But anyway, this 125-minute audio file is one song from Doom Eternal. It's put together in small sections and segments and chunks. These pieces of music play back differently depending on kind of what you as the player are doing. Say you as the Doom Slayer, something really big and drastic happens. The music then instantly changes on the beat to a heavier version of it. So we've killed a lot of the bad guys. The music will change again. And that's kind of how the music in Doom works. It just sort of bounces between all of this stuff depending on what you're doing. It's a cool thing that we can do with video games, and I feel that's a really unique thing with video games.
And conceptually, something like this makes sense. If you have a game where combat is an ebb and flow and there's no clear cut between them, you don't have like a Final Fantasy transition between battle and overworld traversal, then the music then needs to react such that when the player encounters an enemy, the music automatically changes. And even up through the Xbox 360 and PS3 era, you can still see games that utilize this sort of reactionary musical format, but it's still very sloppy. For example, in Oblivion, you know the second you have entered combat and something has started to run towards you aggressively, because the music shifts on a dime. Whereas with something like Doom Eternal, there are purposeful lead-ins and lead-outs between these different reactive elements as well. This is what goes into a modern video game soundtrack composition, and games like Banjo-Kazooie were the start of things like this. It's interesting to think about media more broadly, and the fact that video games' interactivity sets them apart so much from every other typical form of media, whether that's art, movies, music. Everything has to be reactive and cannot simply play out from an A to B with no interruptions. And even if composers at the time had these ideas or like this intuitive understanding of how a video game soundtrack could be composed, it really wasn't until the N64 and PS1 era that we had a surplus of processing power and memory such that we could start to implement these kind of things. Personally, I find it really interesting to look at old games in this sort of context. Not merely, do they still play well today, or was this fun when I was a kid, but what has this game meant to gaming as a whole in the years since it's come out? And I think Grant Kirkhope's contributions to video game soundtracks cannot be understated. So yeah, I think that about covers my thoughts on Banjo-Kazooie. Interestingly enough, I don't have access to Banjo-Tooie through this same method, so that one's just going to stay on my wish list for now. I have also played Yooka-Laylee, and I heard a lot of mixed things about it, but I actually enjoyed it quite a bit. Next up on my list, as far as this franchise and this sort of game is concerned, would then have to be Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair. I own it, it's in the backlog, it's just a matter of when I'm going to play it, and I don't necessarily know when that is. Could be soon. Ultimately, Banjo-Kazooie gets a rating from me of 7 out of 10, which on my scale means recommendable. It's a game that I think if you can get access to it is worth playing all the way through. Obviously, it shows its age in a couple of ways, but I think those are overall outweighed by how well the experience still holds up. Now that this video is done, I can actually get to talking about Jak II next. Sorry to make that a teaser at the end of 2 videos in a row, but let's just blame the effect that Palworld had on my memory, I guess. If you've made it here to the end of the video, then I would really appreciate if you could leave a like, perhaps a comment, and maybe even subscribe to the channel if you like what I'm doing here. As an extremely early content creator, every single piece of interaction is extremely useful in getting these videos out to other people. And if I hope to grow the channel, that's what I gotta do. But with all that being said, I'm gonna get to work on the next one of these, and I'll see you all next time.